Chapter 3. Sanctuary was what it had always meant to him. It was a single-pen cabin, nothing but local timber from the ridgepole on top to the budding pole down below. As a shelter, it was almost as primeval as the nature that surrounded it. The ceiling and floor joists, the eaves, beams, even the stick-and-mud chimney. He had done it all himself in the course of one warm, buggy June, using little more than a pile of wood and a gas-powered chainsaw. It was meant for one person, and he had only ever been there alone. He never spoke of it to anyone he knew. In violation of the rules, he had not told his employers about the acquisition of the lakeside parcel, an acquisition that, to further protect his privacy, he had arranged through a hard-to-trace offshore business entity. The cabin was nobody else's. It was his alone, and there had been times when he'd arrived back at Dulles International Airport, unable to face the world, and would drive nonstop to the simple wood dwelling, covering the 180 miles in just 3 hours. He'd take his boat out and go fishing for smallmouth bass and try to save some part of his soul from the maze of deceit and subterfuge that was his vocation. Lake Aswell hardly merited a spot of blue on any map, but it was a part of the world that made his heart swell. Located at the base of the Sourland Mountains, it was an area where farmland gave way to a thickly wooded terrain and was surrounded by stands of willow, birch, and pignut hickory above a sometimes thick underbrush. In the spring and summer, the grounds were dense with foliage, alive with flowers, berries. Now, in January, most of the trees were drab and leafless. Even so, there was a somber elegance to it all, the elegance of potential. Like him, the woodland needed a season of recuperation. He was bone-weary, the price of long hours and vigilance. The car he started out with was an old blue Dodge Ram minivan, which he had picked up a few blocks from the Cyber Cafe. It was an awkward, boaty ride. What recommended it was simply that its owner had affixed a store key box inside the wheel well. The box was a foolish contraption used by drivers who valued the security of a spare key more than the security of their vehicles. The 12-year-old green Honda Civic he was now driving came from the Trenton train station's overnight parking area and had been protected from theft with similar vigilance or lack thereof. It was as anonymous a model as he could hope for, and so far it had done its job. His mind churned as he drove north on Route 31. Who had done this to him? It was the same question that had preyed on him for untold months. The legitimate, if clandestine, facilities of the United States government had been mobilized against him, which meant what? That someone had lied about him, had somehow set him up, had persuaded higher authorities that he had gone mad, had become a security threat, or that someone or some group with access to the powers of state had sought to make him vanish. Someone or some group that considered him a threat, but that nonetheless chose not to kill him. His head began to throb. A headache was opening behind his eyes like a malignant flower. There were colleagues of his at the Political Stabilization Unit who could help him, but how could he find them? These were not men and women who reported for work at desk jobs. They changed their location regularly, like pieces on a chessboard. And he had somehow been locked out of every electronic forum he knew about. Harrison Ambler not found. It was madness, yet there was method in it, too. He could feel it. Feel the malignity, like the pulsing headache that made him conscious, that made conscious thought a kind of agony. They had tried to lose him. They had tried to bury him. They. The exasperating bare plural. They. A word that said everything and nothing at all. To survive, he needed to know more, yet he could not know more unless he survived. Barrington Falls in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, was off a stretch of Route 31 that flowed through the central New Jersey countryside, cross-hatched by unmarked intersections with small streets. Twice he pulled onto one of those side streets to make sure he wasn't being followed, but there was no sign of it. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard when he saw the small road sign for Barrington Falls. It was 3:30 p.m. Only this morning he was being held in the maximum security psychiatric facility. Now he was nearly home. A quarter of a mile south of the access road to the lake, he pulled the Honda Civic off the road and left it hidden in a copse of hemlock and cedar trees. The fiber-filled tan jacket he had picked up en route kept him warm. As he walked along the springy ground, his footfalls softly crunching on the carpet of leaves and pine needles, he felt the tension beginning to drain from him. Drawing nearer to the lake, he found that he recognized every tree. He heard the fluttering of an owl in the enormous bald cypress tree, its reddish trunk seemingly barkless, gnarled and grooved like an old crone's neck. He could just make out the rubble-work chimney of Old Man McGruder's saddlebag cabin, perilously close to the water on the far bank. It always looked as if one big storm could wash it right into the lake. Just past a dense stand of spruce trees, he pushed through the wooded enclave and reached the magical glade where 7 years ago he had decided to build his cabin. Curtained by magnificent old evergreens on 3 sides, it provided not only seclusion but tranquility. A peaceful view of the lake framed by ancient trees. He had returned at last. Taking a deep, cleansing breath, he stepped through a gap in the line of firs and looked around at a small, empty glade where his cabin should have been. The same clearing he had come upon 7 years earlier when he had decided to build there. A wave of dizziness and disorientation overtook him. He felt as if the ground were rippling beneath his feet. It was impossible. There was no cabin, and no trace that a cabin had ever been built here. The vegetation was utterly undisturbed. His memory of where he had sighted the single-pen structure was indelible, and yet all he could see were patches of moss, a ground-hugging sprawl of juniper, and a low, deer-cropped yew tree that looked to be at least 20 or 30 years old. He walked around the area, circling it, eyes alert to any sign of human habitation, past or present. Nothing. It was a virgin parcel of land, precisely in the state it had been when he had acquired it. Finally, he could no longer fend off the days of incomprehension, and he sank to his knees on the cold, mossy ground. Even to frame the question filled him with fear, and yet he had to. Could he trust his own memories? The past 7 years of his life, start with those. Were his recollections real? Or was his current experience the illusion? Would he awake any moment and discover himself to be in his white-locked room in Ward 4W? He remembered having once been told that when dreaming a person had no sense of smell. If so, he was not dreaming. He could smell the lake water, the subtle fragrances of organic decay, of leaf mold and earthworm castings, the faint resinous odor of conifers. No, it was, God help him, no dream, which is exactly what made it a nightmare. He rose to his feet and let out a low guttural roar of fury and frustration. He had arrived at his soul's own home, and there was no home. A captive could at least nurture the hope of escape. The torture victim, he knew this firsthand, had at least the hope of easeful respite. But what hope had a creature that had lost its sanctuary? Everything here was familiar, nothing was. That was what made it so maddening. That was what was so maddening. He began to pace, listening to the chirps and whistles of winter birds. Then he heard a faint whistling noise of a different kind, and felt a sharp sensation, combining pain and a sense of percussive force just below his neck. Time slowed. His hand reached for the area, felt an object projecting from his body, and yanked it out. It was a long, pen-like dart, and it had hit the top part of his sternum right below the throat. It had hit him there and stuck like a knife thrown into a tree. There is a word for this area of thick bone, Ambler recalled from a training manual, manubrium. In offensive combat, it was a well-protected area you wanted to avoid, which meant that Ambler might have been very lucky. He dived into the low draping branches of one of the great eastern hemlocks, and counting on the temporary invisibility conferred by his hiding place, he examined the metal projectile. It was not merely a dart, it was a barbed syringe dart made of stainless steel and molded plastic. On the syringe barrel, small black lettering identified its pressurized contents as carfentanil, a synthetic opioid 10,000 times more powerful than morphine. A 6-ton elephant could be completely immobilized with just 10 milligrams. An effective human dosage would be measured in micrograms. The sternum was so close to the skin that the needle's barbs had no chance to anchor themselves in his flesh. But what about the contents of the syringe dart? It was empty, but that didn't tell him whether it had emptied itself before or after he pulled it out. His fingers returned to the hard bony ridge beneath his throat. He could feel an angry welt where the dart had struck him. So far he still felt alert. How long had it been in him? His reflexes were fast. Surely the elapsed time was less than 2 seconds. Yet a single droplet could do the task. And a syringe dart of this class was designed to disgorge its contents within moments. Then why wasn't he already unconscious? The question might answer itself before long. For the first time, he became aware that his thinking was growing unfocused, woozy. It was a feeling he was all too accustomed to. He realized that he had been dosed with similar narcotics before, and perhaps many times on Parrish Island. It was possible that he had built up a measure of tolerance. There was a second protective factor. Because the hollow tip of the needle had buried itself in bone, it would have been blocked, the fluid prevented from squirting out freely. And, of course, the complete dosage contained in the dart syringe must have been designed to be sublethal. Otherwise, a bullet would have been less troublesome. A dart like this, though usually a prelude to abduction, was not itself intended to serve death. He was meant to be unconscious by now. Instead, he was merely slowed at a moment when he could least afford any diminishment of his faculties. The carpet of pine needles beneath him now seemed like a good place to lie down and take a nap, just for a few minutes. He would rest now and wake up refreshed, just for a few minutes. No, he could not succumb. He had to feel that fear. Carfentanil, he recalled, had a half-life of 90 minutes. In event of overdose, the optimal treatment was to infuse the opiate antagonist naloxone. But where that was not available, an injection of epinephrine could be resorted to. Epinephrine, better known as adrenaline. Survival would come not from keeping terror at bay, but embracing it. Feel the fear, he repeated to himself. Crawling from beneath the apron of the great eastern hemlock and craning his neck around him. And suddenly he did feel it, as he heard a faint whistling sound again, the sound of rushing air on the rigid, stabilizing wings of a fast-moving projectile, missing him by inches. Adrenaline coursed through his bloodstream, his mouth went dry, his heart began to hammer wildly, and his stomach knotted. Someone was after him, which meant someone must know who he really was. Self-consciousness evaporated, giving way to the deeply laid circuits of training and instinct. Both darts had come from the same direction, from farther up the bank, but what distance? Standard procedure would be to avoid unnecessary close work. A man with a tranquilizer rifle could be effective while stationing himself at a safer move. Given the limited range of the syringe darts, though, the distance could not be great. In his mind, Ambler walked to his southwest, trying to visualize every detail of the terrain. There was a large stand of hemlocks, their branches tipped with small brown cones, a procession of boulders that could be mounted like steps, a gulch where, during the summer, skunk cabbage and lady slippers would flourish in the wet shade, and securely lashed to an old ailing elm, a tree stand for deer hunting. But of course, a sturdy portable stand like that, like so many quote-unquote temporary things, had been put up years ago and never been dismantled. The seat was about 3 feet square. The heavy straps that held it up were secured around the tree and kept in place by a couple of eye bolts that had been threaded through the trunk. The deer stand was, he recalled, maybe 12 feet off the ground that was maybe 12 feet higher than the ground that Ambler was on. Any professional would have taken advantage of it. How long had the man with the trank gun been studying him before he squeezed the trigger? And who the hell were these people anyway? The uncertainties were beginning to tire Ambler, somehow reactivating the micrograms of carfentanil in his blood. I could rest here just for a few minutes. It was almost as if the powerful opiate was whispering the suggestion. No. Ambler wrenched himself back to the present crisis, the here and the now. So long as he was free, he had a chance. That was all Ambler asked for, a chance. A chance to make the hunter taste the fear he had inflicted, a chance to stalk the stalker. The challenge would be to keep his form low while moving through the woods in a quiet, sure-footed manner. He would have to call on training he had seldom used. Rising from the dense, concealing undergrowth to a crouched position, Ambler slowly lifted his knee, relaxing his ankle and foot as he swung it forward while keeping his knee where it was. The toe of his foot touched down and pressed gently against the surface, making sure there were no twigs that might crackle underneath. The rest of his foot followed, toe to heel in a smooth, continuous motion. Keeping his weight evenly distributed across his foot maximized the surface area upon which the force was applied, and so reduced the downward force exerted. Slow and steady, he told himself. But slow and steady was never how he worked. If it hadn't been for the traces of carfentanil in his blood, he wasn't sure he could have stopped himself from bolting. Finally, he completed an elliptical course that led him past the ailing elm tree, and then back toward it. As he drew within 30 feet of the tree, he found a line of sight through the bramble trunks and branches that looked where he expected to find the stand. But though the tree was as he had imagined, there was no stand on it, no stand and no sign of a stand. As cold as it was outside, he flushed hotly, seized with apprehension. If not the old deer stand. The wind gusted, and he heard a sound, faint but distinct, of wood scraping against wood. He turned toward it and finally made it out, a deer stand, another deer stand, bigger, higher, and newer, it seemed, secured to the vast trunk of an old plane tree. As quietly as he could, Ambler moved toward it. Mounded around the base of the tree was the thicket of multiflora rose. If only they lost their razor-sharp thorns in winter as well as their leaves. An invasive species from Asia, it tended to form itself into something like natural concertina wire. And for practical purposes, concertina wire was what it might as well have been, coiled around the trunk of the 90-foot-tall plane tree. Ambler peered through branches past the small and bristly seed pods that were outlined against the sky like pendant sea urchins, and finally made out the figure. He was a big man dressed in camouflage fatigues and luckily facing the opposite direction. That meant that Ambler's movements had not been detected. The rifleman assumed that he was still somewhere on the terrain that sloped down toward the lake. Ambler peered again, straining to see in the late afternoon gloom. The rifleman was holding up to his eyes a pair of Steiner autofocus binoculars, again a military model with low glare-coated lenses and a green, rubberized waterproof casing, scanning the distance intently, methodically. Dangling around his shoulders from a strap was a long rifle. It had to have been the dart gun. But the man also had a small sidearm. From its outline, it was probably a Beretta M92, a 9mm U.S. military issue, but usually reserved for members of special operations units. Was the man alone? He seemed to be. He had no walkie-talkie, no visible communicator, no earphone, as you would expect if he was part of a team, but assumptions could not be made. Ambler looked around himself one more time. His view of the gunman was partly blocked by a thick branch of the old plane tree, its bark dappled but smooth. The branch, if Ambler moved to his left and jumped straight up, his hands could grasp it, at a point where it was probably thick enough to support his weight. The branch projected straight out from the trunk, just about horizontally for maybe 25 straight feet, and for 15 feet of that it was thicker than his thigh, which he guessed meant it was thick enough and strong enough for his purposes. If he could swing himself up on it, he could propel himself over the brambles and within a yard or two of the deer stand. Now he waited for the next gust in the right direction, away from the gunman, toward him, and sprang upward as hard as he could. His hands grasped the branch, not slapping against it, but encircling it swiftly and silently. Another surge from his adrenals enabled him to swing himself up and onto the branch in a single motion. A low groaning noise came from the wood itself as the thick bough flexed a little under his weight, but it was not so loud as Ambler had feared, and the gunman on the deer stand, Ambler was able to see him now, gave no sign that he noticed. The wind had gusted, a tree had grown, the sequence made sense. It did not attract the hunter's attention. Ambler inched his way down the bough, using his hands and feet in rippling sequence until at last the stand's heavy nylon strap was within his grasp. He'd hoped to release the nylon webbing, sending the platform crashing to the ground. That would not be possible. The strap's latch had been positioned on the other side of the trunk toward the stand. In fact, he could not get much closer without making some small sound that would give him away. Ambler clenched his jaw, willing himself to focus. Nothing ever goes according to plan. Revise and improvise. Ambler raised himself to another branch, squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, filled his lungs with air, and pushed off, throwing himself at the gunman. It was a flying tackle of the sort Ambler hadn't attempted since his high school gridiron. It was also a mistake. Alerted by the noise of Ambler's exertion, the man turned around. Ambler, for his part, hit the man too low, at knee level rather than waist level, and instead of being knocked out of the stand, the man fell forward and grabbed hold of Ambler with a grip of steel. It was the most Ambler could do to get his hands on the Beretta. With a powerful blow, the man knocked the pistol from Ambler's hand and into the brambles below. As the two men faced off on the small stand, Ambler could tell he would have the worst of it. The man was 6'5", heavily muscled and yet astonishingly agile. His head was smooth-shaven, a stump-like extension of his thick, powerful neck. He landed blows like a trained boxer, each punch carefully aimed and powered by his entire torso, the arm immediately retracting to a defensive position. It was the most Ambler could do to protect his head. His body was left exposed, and the crushing blows he knew would soon cause him to double over. Now Ambler stepped out of position, slammed himself against the tree trunk, and dropped his hands. He couldn't have said why. The big man looked more pleased than puzzled as he moved in for the kill.